There's really one way to do it if you really want to compress the learning curve, which is start tinkering within something that you deeply understand personally or professionally and just get after it until you get to a place where you start to see the magic. And once you see the magic, you'll never stop doing it because it's unlike any tool or system that we've ever all had access to. And we all remember those moments in time when it happens and it's awesome. And it will just continue to happen regardless of how technical or how deep you are in the space.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abax Technologies introduces Abax Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abax Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abax's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/AbaxLabs. That's github.com/AbaxLabs.
Welcome back to How to Raise Your Agent on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Alec Coughlin, Principal at BairesDev and host of AI with Alec. We'll be discussing the challenges along the journey to integrating AI and AI agents into your business and offering practical advice for navigating that transformation. Hello, Alec. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Thank you so much for having me. Stoked to be here.
Well, it is really great to have a fellow podcast host here among the many hats that you wear. Thanks for coming to share not only your experience working with AI, but also hopefully some of the insights from your guests. Your podcast, AI with Alec, grew out of Ludlow Growth, which you founded a decade ago as a way to document your enterprise AI journey. So I'd like to start there. What makes enterprise AI different from somebody just fiddling around with Claude? And what started you on that journey?
Man, that's a great question. And again, I appreciate being a part of this and honored to be on your podcast, Dave. I'm going to try to answer that question quickly and succinctly, and then you can go anywhere you want to go with it because there's a lot to unpack there. But I think generally speaking, one thing has always been true, and I think it always will be true when it comes to the enterprise, is it's complicated, right? So you can have the best technology in the world and all this technical overhang that we are all so fortunate to have because there's been so much capital and so many smart people plowed into figuring out how to build out all the AI infrastructure. But for big businesses to embrace anything that's different than doing what they've already been doing, it's very complex. And there's a reason that it's called people, process, and technology. And I'll just kind of leave it there. And to answer your second question, I was a part of Digital Transformation 1.0 to oversimplify it. I was very fortunate to join the artist formerly known as Razorfish, which has now become Publicis Sapient. And for those in the audience that remember the 60 Minutes conversation with the founders of Razorfish during the dot-com era kind of boom, when folks couldn't really understand what they were talking about, but they basically said anything that can be digital will be digital. And they were obviously right. And I was very fortunate to join that firm. And I joined it because I found them to be the New York Yankees of digital transformation and the OGs in this space, says a guy from the tri-state area. And I had my infinite curiosity tapped very early and soon thereafter joining Razorfish around all things AI. And so when you combine enterprise complexity with AI and someone who by nature had a background of embedded consulting in the management consulting space going into environments to literally do the work, it's kind of obvious in hindsight why I find myself spending as much time as I can either playing sports, talking about sports, or the equivalent within the world of all things AI, but I do specialize in enterprise AI, data infrastructure, data platforms.
What did you learn from that Digital Transformation 1.0? that you're able to apply to 2.0, if we call the artificial intelligence move in enterprise that?
Man, you got great questions, Dave. All right. How much time you got?
We've got lots of time.
It's interesting being on this side of the microphone, which is has been happening a whole lot more lately as I guess more folks are immersed in this space, but it's a luxury. So I appreciate the great question. I think that the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So back in the day, 2016, let's call it when I joined Razorfish and effectively Publicis Sapient, there are all sorts of people talking about, oh, dot com this, e-commerce that, and oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and it's going to replace all these different things, and it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, and here's a silver bullet. That was going on back then. It was going on at a different pace to where it is now because we weren't experiencing a paradigm shift. This is general purpose, kind of unbelievable technology change, which is exponential change, which is obviously quite different. But there were always a lot of people that were on different ends of the adoption curve. And you kind of have to always be really thoughtful about meeting people where they are, whether meeting them where they are in terms of their technical and data quotient or AI quotient or e-commerce quotient or even industry quotient, right? Because it goes both ways. You can be an outstanding and deeply technical engineer, but if you don't understand kind of the way business gets done in your vertical, you're really hamstrung in your ability to have impact because, frankly, just because you've got a great widget doesn't mean that the industry in any way, shape, or form has any interest in it because they like doing things the way they've been doing them.
And we really need to bridge that divide between those with the technical expertise and those with the expertise in doing the job. Obviously, you've been involved in digital transformation for your whole career. You've been on this enterprise AI journey for about the past 10 years or so, if that's right. And I was curious for people who are just starting, who aren't on the technical side, but they've got a regular job, what lessons or advice do you have for those as they're getting started on their own AI journey?
The first thing that I always recommend, and I hope that it never changes, is just get your hands dirty within your circle of competence. And here's what I mean by that. If you're listening to this podcast and you feel overwhelmed or nervous or excited or some combination of all of those things, you should be, right? Because there's just so much going on and there's so many different innovations that are happening day in and day out, right? But the one thing that you want to always remember is that you really can't get that much value or understanding out of this stuff in the classic way of, "Oh, I'll just read about it, or I'll bring in some management consultants. I'll talk to somebody that's super technical and they'll explain it to me and then I'll know how to ride the bike." No, you just gotta get on the bike and ride it, right? And I know that's time consuming, scary, whatever, but the reality is you gotta get your hands dirty and you gotta do it with guardrails and you gotta do it in your circle of competence so that you can detect when the model and or the tools you're using are either overly confident and wrong, or they're behaving like sycophants, or frankly, you're not necessarily helping the AI help you as effectively as you could. And I'm happy to unpack more tangible examples of that kind of stuff. But there's really one way to do it if you really want to compress the learning curve, which is start tinkering within something that you deeply understand personally or professionally and just get after it until you get to a place where you start to see the magic. And once you see the magic, you'll never stop doing it because it's unlike any tool or system that we've ever all had access to. And we all remember those moments in time when it happens and it's awesome. And it will just continue to happen regardless of how technical or how deep you are in the space.
Definitely no replacement for hands on keys. But though, because with AI with Alec, you have grown a community of people who are getting their hands on the keys, trying to figure out how this works, how to apply it to their own enterprise, their own business. You've got a community of over 15,000 executives now learning together. Why did you want to build a community around this? And what's the benefit of learning as part of a community?
Because my wife told me to. I mean, that's the God's honest truth.
She got tired of talking to you about it?
Yes, is the answer on that, and I love her to death, but she has to put up with it all the time, but no, bringing it back, so my wife is Julia LaRoche. The Julia LaRoche Show is some of your listeners might know, she is a complete rock star podcaster, but prior to starting her podcast, she was a journalist, and when my infinite curiosity around this stuff really started to kick in back in those days I just had mentioned previously, about 2016, give or take. She was the one that essentially said to me, "Are you familiar with this concept, build in public?" And I don't know if she said those exact words, but that was effectively what she said. And I was like, "No, what is that? Sounds interesting." And she said, "Well, you're so geeked out on this stuff." Again, my words, not hers. She doesn't use that kind of language, but she's like, "You're so into it. What if you were to start to document what you're learning and then publish it on LinkedIn, Twitter, and other places, eventually newsletter, podcast, what have you, to not only document your learning journey, but to build like-minded community and also to accelerate your learning, right? Because as a journalist, she made it very clear to me, and you kind of can't really realize this until you do it. It is something else to really sit down and write about something while you're learning it, especially when you think you know it, because there's no jazz hands when you write. There's none of this. There's no PowerPoint slides with little bullets and you can kind of talk your way through it. It is 110% you and the piece of paper, literally and figuratively. And then you got to go ahead and hit publish. And LinkedIn's nice. It's like a conference environment. People won't really be too mean to you or say much about your POV if they don't agree with it or if it's frankly not that well informed. Twitter's a whole different animal. And so I just graduated. I literally was just doing it selfishly to document my learning journey and hopefully compress and accelerate my learning, and along the way build community. And one thing led to another, and as you said, the numbers might not be that significant to those that build community around trying to build a media property, but my community is quite senior. So CEOs and folks one click below a CEO or the equivalent, but the CTO side of the equation for the most part. And the majority are in the financial services and or TMT space. And apparently they enjoy the way I talk about all this Nerdville Alex stuff because even though I'm not an engineer, I'd like to think I'm pretty darn close at this point to that type of technical, but I use language that's a little bit more approachable. And so it's just taken on a life of its own. And I love learning about the people that consume my stuff. And frankly, I never really know who they are. And when it comes up at conferences or wherever, it makes me very happy that it's beneficial and helpful to them along their learning journey as well.
Well, I love that idea of building in public because I think all of us, when we go into this, it's outside the comfort zone. It's easy to want to kind of do it in private where no one can see your mistakes, but it's doing it publicly is a whole nother thing.
Or your wife will tell you how smart you are, right? Which that doesn't happen at my house, but some houses.
Definitely, you've built this reputation as the guy who can help people get smart fast on artificial intelligence. And I wanted to kind of put those two together and ask you in this community of C suite execs that you work with, what do people ask that they're often too embarrassed to ask their own teams?
I think the bucket that comes to mind, and I'll speak to it at a kind of a category level for the audience, and maybe I'll think of another one quickly, but the instinctual one, the one that comes to mind the fastest is developing mental models and a vocabulary that is universal and maintains technical credibility throughout and with the technical counterparts. And I don't know why I'm thinking of kind of the C-suite that's non-technical and one click below for now, but there's a ton of imposter syndrome all over all of these various industries. And I think it's understandable, but it is something that needs to be addressed very quickly. And I'm not exactly sure how it can be addressed other than by, I guess, somewhat folks like me who were fortunate enough to be in this game for 10 plus years, which makes us really old in the AI game, like OG. And we have a comfort, and I can name all sorts of other folks that I follow on Twitter and otherwise that are just outstanding at doing this. But I really do think that it always starts or it gets there very quickly into dimensions of what's the mental model for this? Like, what do you mean by this? Or why is it so important to understand the difference between probabilistic and deterministic software? And what in the world does that even mean? And are all these SaaS companies going to go out of business or are they going to survive and thrive? Like, they start to unload language and mental models and vocabulary. And so that's where analogies, metaphors, and mental models are enormously helpful in this space. And the technology folks, it's always the opposite, right? It's like, I promise I wasn't going to use colorful language, but how do I help this annoying but very smart business person help themselves as opposed to coming over and asking me all these questions about stuff that's so basic and fundamental. And that's when I say, "Hey, you gotta touch grass." And by the way, they know about the culture of the business and the people in the process, and they have P&L ownership. And as much as you think the widget is so important and impressive, your job too is to help them understand it so that they can be your partner and be on your team and play the game.
Yep. I want to switch the conversation for a moment from the newbies to the OGs, because on your own podcast, you've got a lot of great conversations with people who are the practitioners, the people making this happen, integrating it into their own companies as well. And I just wanted to pick your brain for what are some of the most interesting insights that you think of you've gotten from your podcast or your community recently?
The one that I go to immediately is there's a company called TackNode that I met, I guess, coming up on 2 months ago out at a fintech meetup conference in Las Vegas. And Xiaowei Zhang, who's the founder and CEO, has built what effectively could be, and I say could because this is category creation and we all know how complex that could be. But he has built something and is building something with his team that could become the next Databricks, right? So it's a context lake. And I think the thing about Zhao Wei that's the most impressive, beyond all the obvious with the technology and so on and so forth, but the clarity with which this guy thinks and therefore writes is absolutely extraordinary. And I don't think I realized how important that is as a leading indicator of how clear that founder and CEO is about the problem he's solving and how well he understands the three-dimensional aspects of what the problem is, not just the technology, but the people process bit. And so I think one of the things that I find is that the people that I interview, and they tend to be quite technical, I find that those that think the clearest write the best, and I wonder if that's an indication for those in the audience, especially those making business decisions that are tangential to the technology. If you can't read very quickly a few sentences on their website and or their Twitter handle or what have you, if you can't read that stuff and start to kind of grasp it, you have to ask yourself the question is how well does that technologist, founder, team, company understand anything beyond the deeply technical stuff they obviously understand? Because today it's a much bigger game than just technology. There's lots of great technology out there, right? There's technical overhang or deployment overhang, depending on Sam Altman or Dario, whichever one you want to listen to. There's so much the technology can do that it isn't even yet being enabled to do. So it's not like a technology challenge. I really think it's more than that. So I think to your point, David, to your question, I think for me, I really look to the way that founders and CEOs and senior technical leaders communicate in writing around what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it and how they do it, because I think it tells you a lot.
I think it tells you a huge amount, and I think it applies to pretty much every field out there. It raises an interesting question, though, right? Because you have so many people using AI to do their writing for them, and which then can turn into using AI to do your thinking for you. How do you think about that? And how do you see the business folks you work with wrestling with that issue?
I mean, they call it AI slop at this point for a reason, right? Like you can call it all sorts of things. It's like communication inflation, noise, whatever you want to do. But one of my favorite authors is Seth Godin. And one of the reasons why he's one of my favorites, probably because he just writes so much that he's so clear, right? I think he's blogged like, I don't know, 13,000 consecutive days, something outrageous. But one of Seth's most recent books, if not the most recent, I believe it was called This Is Strategy, and I have it somewhere in here. In the preface, he called out, and I don't know if he felt like he needed to or he just wanted to or what have you, but he called out, yes, I absolutely used AI to write this book. In particular, I use Claude because I love Claude and I love Anthropic and I think it's a fantastic company, yada, yada, yada. But what he then said was, let me explain a little bit about how I use it. I do not outsource my thinking. It's a thought partner, it's a coach, it's a lot of things. But at the end of the day, everybody knows you don't outsource your thinking. You got to do your own homework. You have to develop your own, like, it's just, I laugh because I love Seth, and Seth is, he doesn't mince words. So you can look him up, anybody listening. Like, I'm sure he's talked about this on podcasts, all sorts of stuff, but he does talk about it in the front end of his book. But what I would say is just because you can doesn't mean you should. I guess if you're like looking for vanity metrics and you want to game algos or play those games, go for it. And if that's what works for you, go for it. But I can assure you that you're not going to receive nearly the amount of benefit in the short term and the long term than if you walk into a gym and pick up the weights and throw them around and do it yourself. If you want to pay someone to do it for you, like, I guess that's your choice and go for it. I think it's the worst idea. I think it reminds me of atrophy, and I think it's a terrible idea for those of us that want to learn and develop accordingly. If you need to do it for other reasons, and I know there are plenty of other reasons, and I can name them, but I think the question is coming from the place of learning and evolving and growing and real deal expression and point of view and research. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see a scenario where that's a good idea. I think if you go to the gym, you got to pick up the weights. You know what I mean? You don't pay someone to do it for you.
Love that. Like a related issue, I've heard you say that AI accelerates existing problems in organizations. What are some of the common problems? Is it management? What are we talking about?
There are a number of them. I wonder if maybe the best one is to point to one that's probably something we've all experienced, which is sometimes the simpler the question, the harder it is to answer, especially as you get into bigger and bigger companies and you ask questions around process. So, one of the things that happens when you introduce this kind of horsepower into an organization is you all of a sudden exacerbate the problems that are inherent downstream when a process isn't necessarily calibrated in a way that's as efficient as it could be, or things are done in a little bit of a haphazard way. And all of a sudden, there are people that now have these tools where they can effectively produce one, two, 3x or more the output or outcomes, and even stretch across knowledge worker lines, like blurring the lines. Like, simple example, but historically, the constraint with building software is you needed kind of a three-legged stool, which is you need an engineer, you need a product manager, and you need the designer, right? UI, UX. And the three of those folks work kind of together. And it used to be waterfall, and then it became agile, et cetera, et cetera. But now one of those people and a subject matter expert can jump in and switch on Replit, and they can build working software. It's not necessarily production at scale, but they could build software and actually put it out in the wild. And perhaps in doing so, if they were using the wrong tools or doing things the wrong way that maybe an engineer would know because that's his or her circle of competence, they could bleed data into an environment that once it's out, you never get it back. Right. So there's just a lot of different ways that that question could be answered. It's a very good question, but I think that at its root level, if you start with the most fundamental dimensions of stuff that's one click below what's obvious in terms of process within businesses that maybe isn't optimal, if you introduce this kind of horsepower into the equation, all of a sudden problems that were kind of manageable when it was just manual and human and there were checks and balances and humans in the loop, all of a sudden, if you start running some agents on some stuff outside of that and there aren't guardrails and there are holes, some really difficult lessons are going to be learned.
I've heard you say a few times now, stay within your circle of competence. And what's so wild is these tools let us go well outside our circle of competence. You have people talking about operating in God mode. How important do you think it is psychologically for people to stay self aware as they grow that circle of competence?
If you really feel comfortable defining your circle of competence, I think as long as you just use appropriate AI infrastructure, tooling, et cetera, within that circle of competence in general, you're going to know the difference between right, wrong, good, bad, yada, yada, yada. Right. And it's a fantastic way to think about constraining your use of the technology, right? So, hey, my CTO said we can use this toolkit, et cetera, et cetera. He or she's comfortable with it, and therefore let's get to work and start using it. And so you sandbox it, right? Or and maybe you got a colleague that's really good at something that's the cousin of what you do in your circle of competence, or some gray in there and like a Venn diagram or what have you. But the two of you together start to really get to work and just start producing results and outcomes until you get to a place where you really have seen the magic. And what I mean by that is anybody listening to this podcast who has gotten their hands dirty, and I'm sure you have as well, you know when you experience something where you're like, "Oh my gosh, that would have literally taken me, I don't know, 18 hours, 4 days, whatever it might or even that wasn't even possible." And I can give examples recently for me, just one after another. But I really do think it's just very important just to really just have humble confidence, have curiosity, but be really objective about what is it that you're really, really good at, that you really, really understand and know how to do better than the vast majority of folks that you know. And then just really get to work in that area as much as you can. And you'll see very quickly, wow, this model is so confident and it's so wrong. It's like the confidence, you know? Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's why it's really important to be humble, confident, and have guardrails, but try things.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're all going to have to get very familiar with the Dunning Kruger effect because I feel like we're going to live in the age of that. But I wanted to come back to a couple things you said earlier in the spirit of people who are new to this are struggling with just having the mental models or the conceptual framework to start to organize what they're thinking about all this. And then you had mentioned the idea of a context lake. So I was hoping you could just explain for our listeners what is a context lake?
So I'm going to, because I constantly do this, I'm just being sensitive to explaining this to both those that are deeply technical and those that aren't. But imagine the way that a bunch of people that are putting together a big piece of IKEA furniture, imagine the way that whole process unfolds, right? So they take everything out of the box, they put the instructions down, they got all the pieces, they put in buckets and whatever, whatever. And imagine as they're starting to build the big piece of furniture that they're making various decisions along the way. And sometimes they know that their decision is the right decision because it's very clear between the instructions and what they're doing. But then other times they're not, but they're gonna have to learn as they go and they might have to back the truck up, which is annoying. Anybody that's ever built IKEA furniture, I think we all know it's just so frustrating because it seems so obvious when you figure it out, but you gotta back up. And so a context lake can be thought of as imagine if every single action and decision and the context around which who did all of those different things and why and so on and so forth is captured more or less in real time and understood in a codified way that a machine could then understand and translate to an artificial intelligence system that could then help those employees or those humans make better decisions faster or even one step further, not to terrify people, but in the agent to agent world, a context lake enables one agent and or swarm of agents and or the infrastructure that supports who knows an infinite number of agents to make better decisions to enable the agent to act on behalf of the interest of whoever owns the agent while interfacing with another human or another agent. And so context lakes and context graphs for those that want to really geek out, shout out Jaya Gupta of, I believe it's Foundation or Knowledge Capital. She wrote a phenomenal paper on this. That's what knowledge graphs are all about. It's like imagine a knowledge graph on steroids to the next level where you have the ability to understand why things are happening and can act on them in real time. And you need infrastructure that is built differently than the traditional players, whether they be a data warehouse, a data lake. And without naming names, although I already kind of did, there are some really valuable, awesome companies that are very well known that have built out their infrastructure and created tremendous value based on an assumption that unfortunately isn't going to hold go forward much, which is humans interacting with other humans and using the infrastructure. We're very quickly going to get to a place where it's going to be agents interacting with humans and then agents interacting with our agents. And the strain on infrastructure that's built for human interaction and human use, it's going to obviously create an enormous opportunity to rebuild stuff that, like TechNode, I think will be at the forefront of all of this. So I don't know if that got too in the weeds, but that would be a little bit of how I think about it.
No, I'd actually like to dig into it a little bit more with you because I know you spend a lot of time with teams that are building with major data stack tools like Snowflake and Databricks, and you've mentioned TechNode in the context of taking that even a step farther. How do you see teams implementing agents with these as part of their infrastructure? And what does that infrastructure build look like?
I think it was 10 months ago where Gartner out of Australia, I don't know why Australia, and I believe it was Gartner. If it wasn't Gartner, it was Forrester. And I'm so sorry to anybody that works out of those companies. I'm not mixing them up because I don't know the difference. But one of them, and I'll put it in the notes, I believe it was Gartner, had a research report that they published after they did an objective analysis using an MIT framework, I think it was, and perhaps some other stuff, but just a very objective analysis of, I think it was at least 1,200 if not 1,300 plus technology vendors that suggested via their marketing and otherwise that they were agent or agentic. And just to kind of steal the thunder of the report, if you want to guess, you can guess, but it was 1% of those technology vendors that passed a very simple and objective definition of what is or isn't agentic. I only bring it up to be hopefully somewhat funny, but also just to remind us that like we're all trying to figure this out as we go and the world's moving really fast. So the reason I mention that is that also something that's automated versus autonomous versus the ability to think versus the ability to have a human in the loop and on the loop and all this other stuff. Like there's so many considerations that you really need to work through before you really start stepping into the most important question to start, which is why am I doing this? Right? What is the point? So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, including the deeply technical rock stars that I love spending time with, is like, let's not talk about the technology, right? First, let's just talk about what are we trying to achieve? What are the business outcomes? And so I find the people that start there tend to be the people that have a lot more success in making foundational choices and decisions around what type of infrastructure, let's call it data infrastructure slash compute, and then data modeling infrastructure, which steps into the Snowflake and the Databricks environment, et cetera, and of course, TACnode, before then getting into the area of, okay, what does the orchestration layer look like? What kind of a relationship do I want to have directly or indirectly with models and frontier stuff? And then do I want to build one agent? Do I want to build a multi-agent framework? How specialized are they going to be? What's the relationship between the agent and the human and in the loop, on the loop, et cetera, et cetera? And really, I think that the questions that I hear in the beginning of those conversations tend to guide my assessment of how sophisticated and experienced they are. And that's not to judge them, it's just to meet them where they are. And to give one example for the audience, and I've given this one before, but I think it's a really important one. There was I think it was a $900 million a year ARR data analytics company where I knew someone who was in the C suite essentially, and he was panicked. And he came to me with a question around this question. He's like, help me understand why these agents are just flying off the rails. We were promised by this vendor, and I'm not going to name who the vendor was, that if we did the following, which is basically get the AI or the data AI ready, which is no good sales pitch vendor, then we could just like have a bunch of agents do a bunch of stuff and rock and roll. And so I asked the guy, I said, data hygiene and like piping and stuff, when stuff breaks, who on the CTO's team is responsible for that? Is that the technology vendor? Do you have a third party? Or do you guys have a data engineering team? The facial expression kicked in. He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, what do you mean? What do I mean? Right. You haven't thought about like if you use a tennis racket enough and you play enough tennis, you're going to break a string and you're going to have to get it restrung. That's what this is. And he's like, oh, you know what? And so then I couldn't help myself, and it's a friend, so I could ask this question. I said, "Are you telling me that your CTO of a $900 million a year data analytics company that was born 20 years ago, in their defense, didn't necessarily understand the second order implications of getting your data AI ready, putting an agentic platform and framework, an orchestration layer on top of it, and then deploying agents and just thought they were just gonna run perfectly for, like, ever?" And he was like, "Dude." And I was like, "Dude." That was pretty much my response, and that was the end of the conversation before he went back to the CTO. So they had to learn a very difficult lesson in a very hard way. So I say that also to make people feel better, right? It's don't believe all the hype. Nobody has all this stuff figured out. Everyone's trying to figure it out. You gotta have humble confidence. You gotta get in there and figure it out. But if you're the CTO of a data analytics company and you make that kind of mistake, I'm not really sure what to tell you, but that's terrifying. And those are real stories. And that was about 9 months ago.
The more I listen to you, the more I take away. This is really requiring us to think deeply about our work processes and just how we do things and think systematically through things that we probably take for granted. We do it because that's the way it's always been done. That's not the world we're in anymore. But I can understand why you're busy also as principal at BairesDev, where you're building AI agents and workflows and compound AI systems to help companies become AI first. What does it mean to be AI first? What do you see as the key elements an organization must have to deserve that label?
That's been evolving. I don't know if it was April or May of last year, but there are a series of memos that came out. Toby Lutke comes to mind. I think he's one of the first, where the CEOs essentially said of these very successful technology companies, right? So they were very close to the frontier and really understand this stuff. But they basically were like, being AI first means that you reflexively look to AI to help solve a problem the second you come up with a problem that maybe you can't solve yourself and or your team can't solve, et cetera. And so developing that kind of feel for the power and the utility of AI tooling and infrastructure and systems is a hallmark of culturally a company that is really becoming AI first. It's very difficult to quote unquote quantify and measure, but it's like the culture of a company, right? There's a lot of different ways to define the culture of a company, but one way would be when the CEO, executive leadership team, whenever they leave a conference room, it's the way that people interact with each other when the bosses are gone, right? Like that's culture. And so it's a culture of embracing this stuff and using it to the nth degree. Now, you can get a whole lot more quant when you start looking at product and engineering orgs because it's much easier to measure who is building software or whatever from scratch versus who's using these bulldozers versus shovels to produce two, three, four, in some cases, 10x what they were able to produce previously. And then to take it a couple steps further, and you've heard about these companies, some of which are in the public domain, where they're now starting to talk about what percentage of their code is being written with AI agents doing the actual coding and engineers abstracting, right? Meaning designing the systems and the architecture and so on and so forth. So I think the current definition that I kind of like, and I'm going to steal it from somebody, I'll remember who to give credit to eventually, but is someone was recently interviewed on one of my favorite podcasts, Invest Like the Best. And I think this someone was Gavin Baker, and he might have said this, but if it wasn't him, it was somebody else on Invest Like the Best. But basically, it had to do with the idea that companies today that are led by CEOs and executive leaders that are literally using insert name, Replit, Lovable, whatever you want to call it, Cursor, to literally build things. And therefore, they've seen the magic and they're experiencing it, are a whole lot further and closer to AI first than any company that isn't. And the reason is because once they see it and they really experience it, they then start to step into this notion of, okay, what can we automate? How do we augment our people? And then how do we rewire our operating model and or step into AI native pods of a couple different people cross functionally and stand up net new businesses and do so in a way that answers the simple question, which is if we were to reinvent our business today, knowing what we know and what we have available to us today, what would the business look like? Those are some pretty straightforward ways to gauge whether or not a company is or isn't AI first. And you can tell when you talk to people pretty quickly who's got that look where you know they've done it. And then there's other people where they got the other look where they're trying to figure out how quickly you're going to figure out that they haven't. And you can imagine how often that happens when people talk to me or avoid talking to me, which is another way I know.
You've emphasized the hands-on keys path, and as people are trying to integrate AI into more of their company with the end state of trying to get it to be part of the culture, we're hearing a lot more now about forward deployed engineers. Could you just explain that approach and how important do you think that's going to be as companies look to implement AI and AI agents?
Yeah, for sure. So within the context of technology, it was more or less people debate this, but it was pioneered by Palantir, and they were made fun of for that for a long time until they became one of the fastest growing companies in the world. And all it really means, especially for those that or in the financial services and finance industry and familiar with the work of management consultants, et cetera. If you imagine a management consultant that embeds, right? So the management consultant that goes into the client's environment and doesn't just like go into a whiteboard and like whiteboard stuff or like go away and like develop a PowerPoint deck and then deliver it and that's it. Like when you embed, you're actually doing the work. So you're almost like a borrowed executive, for lack of a better term. So a forward deployed engineer is one part that, another part, someone who's deeply technical. They don't necessarily have to be an engineer per se, but typically they are. And so they have both the sensibility of a management consultant who is business strategy savvy and kind of understands the way business gets done and the people and process bit, but they've also got that deeply technical side, right? So they can have a conversation with the CTO and the CTO's team that maintains technical credibility and bridge all those gaps. And so the reason forward deployed engineers ultimately have become so incredibly important, and some describe it as the most in demand job in the world right now, in the world of technology and otherwise, I guess technology or technology adjacent, is because when OpenAI and Anthropic within like 18 hours of each other announced joint ventures, with some major private equity players to stand up these forward deployed engineering joint ventures, but professional services organizations to stretch those capabilities across all the portfolio companies and then some with direct access to the big frontier players. Google soon thereafter made another announcement about the doubling down in the investment they're making. It's really just an admission that clearly wasn't the main message, but it's an admission that this stuff is really hard, right? And it's not just like, oh, just take the AI off the shelf and put it in place and like just AI it and we're good to go. No, it's anything but that. And it took folks a while to kind of get to that place. But the simplest way I would describe the answer to that question behind the question, right, is I don't know that we've ever seen as much capital and as many super smart people, like the density of that technical talent, go after such a very specific type of problem and drive this much technological innovation and problem solving. And so what that basically means is that the technology has far exceeded most companies' understanding and certainly their implementation and or enablement. And so that's referred to as technical overhang or deployment overhang. Closing that gap is not a technology question. Closing that gap is a people, process, and technology question. And therefore, you need to embed people that have that makeup and that cross functional skill set. And to bring it all the way full circle, my first major management consulting project, which feels like a million years ago before I got completely hooked in 2016 all this AI stuff, I was a embedded management consultant in the NFL for the artist formerly known as the St. Louis Rams for 3+ years. And we embedded ourselves in the business to kind of restructure and scale it. So I have a lot of love for deployed engineers and embedding. And it's just a reflection of how complex and difficult this stuff is and the calibration of talent that you need to kind of close that gap and create a whole lot of compound growth in your operating model and or your new operating model.
Thanks again to Alec Coughlin, principal at BairesDev and host of AI with Alec. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of How to Raise Your Agent. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abax Technologies introduces Abax Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abax Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abax's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/AbaxLabs. That's github.com/AbaxLabs. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.